Okay, welcome to the award session of IJCAI. And today we are very lucky to have 4 excellent talks. So let me start with the first one. The first one is IJCAI Award for Research Excellence. That was supposed to be presented last year in the last IJCAI. But you know, because we had other arrangements, so it's this year. And the award is given to Andrew Barto for his groundbreaking and impactful research in both theory and application of reinforcement learning. So let me first present the award to Professor Barto.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No photo? Okay.
No photo.
Okay, good.
Please. Okay, so yours.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. I just want to start by saying how grateful I am to receive this award. I'm overwhelmed with the recognition and being among the past award winners, many of whom have been heroes of mine for many years. So I really would like to express my appreciation to IJCAI, and also especially permitting me to postpone this award for a year. I was unable to travel to Australia last year, so coming to Stockholm is an easier trip, and I really appreciate the organizers for making arrangements for me to accept the award here. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. My talk so I retired 6 years ago. So this is not a state-of-the-art talk. It's really history, mostly. And I think it's important now that RL seems to have risen to quite a pitch of notoriety that people appreciate some of the history of this field, at least history from my point of view. So in this talk, I'm going to really try to present why I have maintained interest in this field for 40 years. And it's really consisted of connections that have been made between AI and other disciplines, and also a variety of surprises that occurred along the way. And I think by talking about this, I can give a sense of the fabric of ideas that have come together in what we think of now as reinforcement learning. So let me begin by turning this on. And a little bit about me. I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and I received a PhD in 1975. I was in a group that focused on cellular automata, which is the subject I wrote my dissertation on, and genetic algorithms. John Holland was one of the principals of the research group. I was influenced by his work, but I never bought the whole story of genetic algorithms, although I owe a lot to Holland's mentoring. Then, after that, I became a postdoc at the University of Massachusetts with the Cybernetics Center for Systems Neuroscience, which was founded by Michael Arbib. And it was a grant called Goal-Seeking Components for Adaptive Intelligence. This was 1977. This was neural networks, which, and this really preceded the rebirth of neural networks. It was a very early effort to look at some possibilities with neural networks. So this grant was really inspired by Harry Clough, who was a senior scientist with the avionics directorate at the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. And he had a hypothesis, the hedonistic neuron hypothesis. And according to this, neurons are individually hedonists that work to maximize a local analog of pleasure while minimizing a local analog of pain. and he wrote a book and a number of articles about this, and he was instrumental in creating this program that hired me as a postdoc, whose goal was to assess the scientific significance of this idea. Was it a crazy crackpot idea, or did it have some scientific merit, and was it worth pursuing? And joining us was a graduate student, he had gotten a bachelor's degree from Stanford, and Rich Sutton joined us in this research project. And you all know Rich as a co-author of the reinforcement learning book that's pictured here. And I have to say, we have a second edition that's in press and available on the network as well. So Rich joined us, and let me now say a little bit about machine learning, just very briefly to say how I think of reinforcement learning, how it fits in to machine learning. So supervised learning, we all know about that, learning from labeled examples, and or learning with a teacher, as it's sometimes called. And in this case, in many instances, for example, neural networks, an error, so difference between target output and actual output, is used to update the parameters of the learning system. This is a sample gradient vector, generally, and that's supervised learning. The simplest version can be used for doing lots of useful things. Unsupervised learning, learning from unlabeled examples, some kind called learning without a teacher. Clustering is kind of the prototypical example of unsupervised learning. And then reinforcement learning is the training information are evaluations and not error vectors. So this is learning to increase the amount of reward and decrease the amount of penalty. And this has been called learning with a critic rather than a teacher. So the critic evaluates the system's behavior. It doesn't provide a gradient. It need not know what the target output should be. In fact, a unique property of RL is that the critic does not even need to see the output of the learning system. It can base its evaluation on some distal consequence of that learning system behavior that's produced through some unmodeled system that's perhaps perturbed by other inputs as well. So the critic the critic does not even need to see the output of the learning system. And this is a very important property of reinforcement learning. Now, the roots of this go back to a psychologist, Edward Thorndike, who talked about learning by trial and error. And he studied, among other things, cats in puzzle boxes. He'd put a cat in a box, and the cat was motivated to get out because there was usually food outside the box. And it would flail around and eventually stumble on the method of releasing itself. Then he'd put it back in the box, and the cat would let itself out much more quickly. And after multiple times, it would release itself immediately. Most cats, not all cats. And he called this learning by trial and error, and coined this law of effect, which I've written here, quoting from a 1911 manuscript of Thorndike. And if you read this, it's basically the simple idea that if you do something and it's followed by satisfaction, then it becomes more probable. And if it's followed by discomfort, it becomes less probable. And note here that it's in the context of a situation. So the connection between the situation and the response is either enhanced or diminished according to the consequent evaluative input to the system. Law of effect has been very controversial in psychology, but it's still around and seems to be a very common sense notion of learning, known to psychologists as trial and error learning. Now, to me, reinforcement learning is search plus memory. So search, trial and error, generating test, variation, selection, and so on, but it's not just search, it's memory. So the system remembers what worked best for each situation, and it can start there the next time a similar situation occurs. So RL is about caching search results, so you don't have to keep searching. And you can think of this as memoized search, if you know the idea of memoization, sort of cache the results of a computation. This is caching the results of search, and it's better maybe thought of as memoized contextual search, because there are multiple contexts. It's not just one search, it's multiple searches, and systems build a memory that caches the results of these searches. So to me, that's the essence of reinforcement learning. And our first surprise in looking into this was that trial and error learning had not been intensively studied from an AI point of view. This is puzzling because you think such a common sense idea would have been, and it had been studied, but not intensively. And one of the issues is that trial and error learning is not error correction learning. And to this day, many people conflate these two things, and mostly what's being done is error correction. One can see that trial and error, maybe the terminology is misleading. It should be trial and evaluation, not trial and error. But error correction, as is done, for example, in supervised learning, neural networks, is not trial and error learning. It's error correction. It's different. There were exceptions, of course. Alan Turing, in 1948, talked about a penalty pain, pleasure-pain system. He never implemented it, but I think that's the first suggestion of implementing something like this on a digital computer. And there were others, notably Minsky. Minsky's thesis was a reinforcement learning system, and others. And then in other disciplines, statistics, engineering, math, psychology, and economics, there are threads of reinforcement learning in those disciplines. In AI, I think it got a bad rap. For example, Minsky and Selfridge say that it's unlikely to even get any indication that something good has happened. And so I think this idea became sort of a prototype of a weak method. Now, an early paper with Rich and a graduate student, Peter Brower, was 1981, a reinforcement learning associative memory. And I was influenced by John Holland's genetic algorithms. I wanted to do something like that, but not like a genetic algorithm. That idea, together with the associative memory networks that Kohonen and others were looking at in those days, led us to think about building an associative network, but where the outputs were not specified by examples, but the system had to try things and have them evaluated in order to come up with the output that produced the highest reward, without that ever having been presented to the system. And so we created this, what we called associative search network. It would be called contextual search these days, I think. But it was a neural network where the neurons had noise in them, which really drove the search. So instead of a population, as in genetic algorithms, the stochastic activity generated the variety that enabled the search. And then we added a predictor, because the contexts were just random inputs. And when the context changed, the reward would change as a function of the context change. We didn't want the system to learn on the basis of that. And so we had a predictor, and I only mention this because when we continued, we did shift to systems where the action of the network not just created a reward signal, but also changed the state and the context vector. And this was really a control problem, which we illustrated with this pole balancing system way in the early 80s. And it led to this actor-critic architecture, which consisted of a critic which allowed the system to learn when the evaluative information was delayed beyond in the future, making the so-called credit assignment problem difficult. So a predictor became an important element of a system like this. And Rich Sutton's thesis involved the development of what's now known as the temporal difference algorithm. And I show the too faint. But anyway, this is so-called temporal difference error. And it's an error, as in error correction, but it's different than a usual supervised learning algorithm because it's predicting not only some external signal, namely the reward, but also predicting its own future prediction. And so you can see in that error, there's an ST plus 1, V of ST plus 1, V of ST. So the TD error I mentioned because it has played a significant role in some later developments. Okay, so one interesting connection, an important connection, was with Arthur Samuel's checkers player. We weren't quite aware of this at the time, but we did become aware that the temporal difference algorithm was really an improvement on Samuel's hallowed method for adjusting an evaluation function for the game of checkers. He described his algorithm saying we're attempting to make the score calculated for the current position look like that calculated for terminal board positions of the chain of moves that most probably occurred during play. This was in 1959, and it's Sutton's TD algorithm actually is an improvement on what Samuel was doing. It led to another important connection, namely to dynamic programming, optimal control and dynamic programming. Richard Bellman introduced dynamic programming in '53, and a key part of that is very much like Samuel's method of adjusting weights in his scoring polynomial and in Sutton's TD algorithm. And two surprises came along with this. One is I don't think AI followed up much on Samuel's checkers player. Samuel's checkers player was a genuine trial and error learning system till recently. Now, of course, we have systems that for example, AlphaGo, that are trial and error systems. And the other surprise is apparently Samuel and Bellman never talked to each other. So I think I can find no indication that either of them was aware of the work of the other one. And I think because there were separate silos that these people were working in. And I think one of the key contributions of reinforcement learning, as we study it in AI, is that it has really bridged this silo, because now there's clear communication among people in these various disciplines. In fact, in AI, I think dynamic programming was really not thought of in the most sophisticated way. For example, Niels Nielsen regarded it as essentially breadth first. It is breadth first in a sense, but it's memoized. Memoization is a key to dynamic programming. All right, so another surprise was TD Gammon that Jerry Tesaro did in the early 90s, where this system could play as well or better than human experts. And a number of surprises. He used a multi-layer network trained with backpropagation, and it was a Monte Carlo system that learned through multiple simulated games. And this is a way of beating the curse of dimensionality, because the state space is so big, and it turns out that many of those states are irrelevant. So how do you know that? Well, through multiple Monte Carlo games, you can focus the computations of DP onto relevant parts of the state space. So this is a key feature of what Jerry did. And people had been studying Monte Carlo simulation-based optimization in other fields. But I think for me, this was a revelation. And it was also a revelation because RL had the reputation of being really slow. And in this case, since they're 10 to the 20th states, one sweep of DP would take thousands of years. And so from this point of view, DP was that RL was really fast, taking only several million games rather than thousands of years to do exhaustive sweeps. And it was really due to this Monte Carlo control of the simulations. So RL is still slow, but it has an advantage in many types of problems compared to classical dynamic programming methods. Now, another connection, and I'm not sure what the time is. I can't see the program. Oh, yeah. How much? 10 more minutes? Oh, good. Okay, so this is a surprise and a connection that is relatively recent, and that is the connection between the TD error and the dopamine in the brain. And so dopamine is one of several neuromodulators, has lots of effects on target sites where dopamine is sent via an extensive array of nerve fibers. One of its main functions is in reward and reinforcement. And so a very interesting connection was made between dopamine and the TD error. This is a picture of the axon of a single dopamine neuron in a rat's brain. Huge axonal arborization. This is the output fiber of a single neuron that goes to many, many thousands of other cells in the brain. So it's a broadcast system, and it turns out that the signal, at least some aspects of the signal, is very well modeled as the temporal difference error. And this is due to work that Wolfram Schultz did in recording from awake behaving monkeys while they were performing certain tasks. And this is a famous collection of pictures showing that this phasic activity, this sort of bursts of activity of dopamine cells, initially is triggered by a reward, the monkey putting a morsel of raisin in its mouth. But with continued trials, if there's a predictive stimulus, the response of the dopamine neuron ceases at the time of the reward and moves back to at the time of a predictor of reward. Then if there's an earlier predictor, it moves back to that. And this is exactly what TD error does. It's this backup process that Samuel was doing, and that dynamic programming does, and that the TD error does. And so this realization, I think it's fair to say, has revolutionized neuroscientists' thinking about the brain's reward system. These cells are not the reward themselves, they're a reinforcement signal that corresponds very closely, not exactly, but to the TD error. So the ideas have filtered into neuroscience, I think, in a very productive way. And that's been very exciting to me to see this contact to the reality of a brain. And in fact, the hypothesis in neuroscience is the prediction error hypothesis, and it's stated here, basically this phasic activity of mesencephalic, midbrain dopamine neurons signals a temporal difference error. And this was really quite earth-shaking and has influenced, has created many, many, many experiments in neuroscience, plus theoretical work related to this idea. In fact, the Actor-Critic Architecture, people have hypothesized that you can fit it into the brain in a certain way. This is speculative, of course, but it fits some aspects of the anatomy of the brain's circuits that are involved in reward-based learning. Okay, then there's AlphaGo and AlphaGo Zero, speaking of surprises. So I think we were surprised at the amazing performance of these systems. This and the follow-up algorithms that DeepMind has been talking about are surprising as well. And to me, certainly deep convolutional neural networks play an important role in these, but I think Monte Carlo tree search is a key ingredient because it's a execution time planning system that's doing Monte Carlo runs, maybe thousands of them for each move. And so it, together with RL to store, to cache a value function, has been instrumental in allowing these systems to exhibit the kind of performance that they do. Okay, now what about Clough's hypothesis of hedonistic neurons? What has happened to that? Well, I think that neuroscience is getting close to something that is very similar to what Clough was proposing and very similar to the actor learning rule that we had experimented with years before. And in neuroscience, it's called reward modulated spike time independent plasticity. And this is a very interesting feature of certain ways that synapses, which correspond to the weights in an artificial neural network, are adjusted over time. And I don't have time to go into the details of this, but it's close to reality in neuroscience. They're still collecting data to see there's an eligibility period of various time durations and so on. So I think that this will be a big thing in neuroscience as we go into the future. All right, some challenges. There are lots of challenges with regard to reinforcement learning. To me, one of them is the challenge of designing reward functions. This is Nick Bostrom has called the idea, the fact that a reinforcement learning system or any optimization process can come up with something that you didn't expect. And he called this perverse instantiation. Be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. In fact, Norbert Wiener, the founder of cybernetics, talked about this some decades ago. And here's a quote from him. He used the monkey's paw horror story as an example of this. And it grants what you ask for, not what you should have asked for or what you intend. And this is true for reinforcement learning, and it's something that one has to be careful with. It's one of the reasons I was interested in it, because from one point of view, these systems are creative. They do things that you didn't expect or didn't program into them, but sometimes these things can be dangerous depending on how the system is deployed. So I think this has been talked about a lot, and things like King Midas's Golden Touch is a familiar example, and there's a wonderful '67 movie called Bedazzled that is really a humorous account of some of the ways that things can go wrong with optimization. Now, and just to conclude here, I think at the very minimum, what is needed to deal with some of these negative consequences is the idea of corrigibility. Advanced AI systems need to permit humans to change their reward signal. And this has been called, this is an instance of corrigibility, and I think at the very least, one needs to be able to change the reward signal of an artificial intelligence. So with that, I'm going to stop. And thank you for your attention. This is a kind of brief summary of what I said. And I thank you for your attention, and I think there's a bit of time for questions. So everything was completely clear. Okay. Ah, there's one.
Thanks, Andrew, for the wonderful talk. I think it was quite eye-opening. And as an initial graduate student from IIT Delhi, it is quite, you are a celebrity to all of us. So my question relates to, so there has been a lot of hype on that the RL signals, RL systems are not going to work because they take a lot of samples to work on. And you can play with the games, but if you want to go into the real world, you have to scale to that instance. And in that point, many people ask for model-based RL or like, and you didn't touch on that dimension of the RL. So what are your thoughts on that? And yeah, is it model-based RL, which is the next thing we have to solve and we have to understand a bit more, or not? So some thoughts on that.
Yeah, great question. Well, from one point of view, a program like AlphaGo is a model-based system. It's using a model to run Monte Carlo trials. But there are other kinds of model-based systems. I think they're very important. In fact, psychologists have distinguished between habits, which is a sort of learning by non-model-based RL, and goal-directed behavior, which is really the result of planning, where the animal sort of thinks about what would happen if it did various things, and then is targeting its behavior toward a goal. And experiments show that both of these systems seem to be at play in animal behavior, and I think in AI the same thing is important. The model-free system has advantages in that it's faster and can be based on a whole lot of data, whereas a model-based system may be easier in some cases. And what experiments show is that initially learning seems to be model-based, but with extended experience it shifts to a more reflexive, habitual type of behavior. And I think this is an important principle for artificial systems as well. So it's not that there's one type of algorithm. I think all of these types of algorithms can be at play and can support each other in an artificially intelligent system. So I think a lot can be learned from what psychologists and neuroscientists have discovered about learning in animals. So, but it's a very good question. I guess I'm in favor of both model-free and model-based algorithms. Great, thanks. Okay.
Yes. Our cameraman is here.